At the time of this recording, the object 3I Atlas is in the constellation of Scorpius at a distance of 396,760,837 kilometers and dropping very, very rapidly. Its current right ascension is 16 hours, 10 minutes, and 40 seconds in the sky, and its declination is negative 16 degrees, 14 minutes, and 4 seconds. Those, of course, are apparent coordinates. But here's the big thing about 3I Atlas, its size and brightness. And I think you just saw how enormous this object is compared to Oumuamua if the objects were to pass one another at a close distance. But the magnitude of 3I Atlas, and this is one of the things that's drawing so much attention to it, is 16.4. Now that is not very bright. It's not bright enough to be seen with the naked eye, and even powerful binoculars would be hard-pressed to spot something that dim. However, 2I Borisov, an interstellar comet that became rather bright in the heavens, far brighter than Oumuamua ever did, had a magnitude of approximately 21 at this distance. Now, for those of you who are not that familiar with astronomical terminology, that means that 3I Atlas is 251 times brighter than 2I Borisov was at the same distance. Ridiculously bright, meaning that it has to be a very large object, or it's producing far more material, far more dust and outgassing than 2I Borisov ever did. But here's the problem. 3I Atlas has been subjected to intensive spectrographic analysis, and up to this point, there is no incontrovertible evidence that there's any traditional outgassing happening with this object. Yes, some evidence of water was detected, although far from conclusive, but there is no gas. None of the gases associated with traditional cometary outgassing that we would expect to find in conjunction with said water happening with this object, and yet it remains bright. And this is just one of many reasons that this object has been the subject of so much controversy, just as Oumuamua is. But is 3I Atlas more artificial looking than Oumuamua was? Which object is actually more controversial, more mysterious? Well, we're going to examine that question along with some brand new information about 3I Atlas in this, our latest update about the newest interstellar visitor to our solar system. Good afternoon, alien enthusiasts, and welcome to another Angry Alien Bulletin. Going to be talking about 3I Atlas again. It's a topic that I've been revisiting over and over again lately, but that's something that I believe is necessary given the scientific significance of this event. Nothing like this from an astronomical standpoint has happened before. That being the case, this is something that needs to be watched very, very closely for any new developments, any new theories, any new papers that might have been written, articles about the topic, etc. And one thing that I'm starting to find to be quite interesting is the fact that even some members of the mainstream media are starting to talk about this object as if it might not be a comet. They are saying, even really as I say, that most likely this object is natural rather than artificial, but still the artificial scenario needs to be considered. And now it appears that even mainstream journalists are starting to talk that way, although not scholarly journals. That sort of stuff remains lock in step with the scientific mainstream, and that's to be expected. If you say anything different than what the mainstream tells you to say, you're going to be subject to mockery, and frankly, you might lose your ability to publish on these topics in the future. That's especially the case, by the way, for scientists, young scientists just out of university, that sort of thing. They are in a publish or perish environment. And if their articles do not get published for peer review, that really puts their future, their careers in serious jeopardy. And if they get a reputation for talking about topics they're not supposed to be talking talking about and they don't get peer reviewed, that could really put their jobs on the line. Not everybody is Avi Loeb. Not everybody has best-selling books and wide publications, a long and respected career. Without all of that, you are really putting your future in danger if you talk about these sorts of topics. Fortunately, for YouTubers/journalists like myself, I can say whatever the hell I want to, and that's what I'm going to do. So once again, let's talk about Oumuamua and 3I Atlas. Which of these objects are more unusual? Which of these objects bear a greater resemblance to an artificial object? There's a lot of factors to be considered because even though these objects are radically different on a lot of different levels, the things that they do, things about their trajectories, things about their behavior, there's actually a surprising amount of similarity there, which of course is the whole reason that we are considering, well, some people are considering anyway, the possibility that both of these objects were sent here by design. You will notice, by the way, that 2I Borisov was never ever looked at in this regard. It is definitely recognized as being an interstellar comet. It did everything that a comet should do and had nothing about its trajectory, about its behavior, anything else that triggered any sort of speculation, any sort of suspicion, even on the part of people like Avi Loeb. But 3I Atlas is radically different. So what we're going to do here is compare the two objects, talk about the things that have sparked the curiosity of people like Avi Loeb, and determine which of them bears the greatest resemblance to an artificial object, the product of an alien civilization. And of course, we are also going to cover new news about 3I Atlas, new information that has come out in the last few days that have just made the mystery about this object more and more difficult to decipher. So first of all, let's talk about the trajectories of these objects and how unusual both of them actually are, or rather were in the case of Oumuamua. What you're watching right now is a 3D depiction of our solar system and 3I Atlas's course through it. As you can see from this image and also this one, 3I Atlas came into our solar system very, very close to the plane of the ecliptic. And as you can see from this caption, the odds of that happening purely by chance are approximately 1 in 500. Not a ridiculously low chance, but nevertheless, the odds are heavily against it. And then, combined with this unlikely event, you also have the object arriving in the solar system at precisely the right time to make a close encounter with 3 different worlds in our solar system, less than 1 astronomical unit away from Mars, Venus, and Jupiter. The odds of all of those things happening purely by chance are tens of thousands to 1, depending on which source you turn to. But let's have a look at Oumuamua's trajectory. That also is a bit odd. Even though it did not come in on a trajectory that corresponded with the plane of the ecliptic as far as the solar system is concerned, its path completely adhered to the plane of the ecliptic as far as the galaxy is concerned. It barely deviated at all from the central plane of the galaxy seen edge on. The orange box shows Oumuamua's path through the galaxy. The blue box shows 2I Borisov's path through the galaxy, which, by the way, is very similar to our sun's path through the galaxy. Oumuamua barely travels away from the plane of the galaxy at all. That is extremely unusual for a random interstellar object. On top of that, before encountering our solar system, Oumuamua was adhering to a speed called the local standard of rest, meaning that its position was essentially stationary relative to the stars orbiting around it. It was rotating around the galaxy at the same overall speed as the galaxy itself was rotating. This would be incredibly useful if Oumuamua were a navigational aid of some kind, because it remains stationary relative to the stars around it, making it extremely useful for other vessels trying to navigate between those stars. Or it could also be in an ideal position to intercept various stars as they rotated into its zone of operation, so to speak. And perhaps that's what happened with our sun. Once Oumuamua realized that it was going to encounter our sun, it adjusted its speed and trajectory whereby it would intercept our planet, the most promising planet in the Goldilocks zone, at exactly the right time. Not only was Oumuamua's trajectory ideally set up to intercept our sun, perform a slingshot maneuver around our sun, and then subsequently intercept Earth, but also it arrived at exactly the right time to intercept Earth as it was making its orbital path around the sun. Had it arrived a couple of months earlier or later, it wouldn't have come close to Earth at all. The odds of all of those things happening purely by chance are at least 250,000 to 1, and we have to be very generous when assigning those kinds of odds. It was probably a lot less likely than that. So as far as trajectories are concerned, I would say both objects are equally anomalous. That being the case, then, we should also look at the physical appearance of these objects. Is there anything about them that are atypical? And we'll start off with 3I Atlas, and I'm going to quote from an article from thedebrief.org, a relatively mainstream journalistic periodical, and this is highly unusual for them to be drifting into this type of talk, but it's very good that they're starting to do it. Quote, recent photos of the interstellar object 3I Atlas obtained by the Hubble Space Telescope reveal features that are atypical when it comes to the normal appearance of comets. Typical comets develop a tail as sunlight pushes dust and gas away from the nucleus, trailing in the opposite direction of their motion. However, Hubble imagery shows dust emitted from the sun-facing side and a faint tail pointing away from the sun, consistent with dayside sublimation. Some images emphasize a bright, slightly forward-biased coma. Loeb likens this to spotting a zebra without stripes, arguing that such a sun-facing emission with a weak tail away from the sun is an unusual feature. Quote, if you see an animal that doesn't have stripes, you can't say it's a zebra because that is its defining characteristic. Now, in early August, the publication of a new pair of papers offered additional data on 3I Atlas. One of these, a study based on data obtained with the SOAR telescope in Chile, examined the object's light spectrum, taken when it was 4.4 astronomical units away from the sun. The reflected light appeared reddened, yet no gas signatures from typical cometary molecules such as carbon, carbon monoxide, or neutral oxygen were detected. The authors called this a, quote, paradoxical situation of early onset coma without evidence of sublimation tracers, which they said calls for other dust liberating mechanisms that ancient interstellar objects may be subjected to. So even if you think this is a natural object, there are things about it that are quite anomalous and might only be characteristic to objects that have been traveling between the stars for millions or perhaps billions of years. And then the second paper by David Jowett and his colleagues analyzed Hubble's first images of 3I Atlas, concluding that it is indeed a comet with a small nucleus surrounded by a substantial dust cloud. But Avi Loeb pointed out a significant problem with this theory. If the reddening in the spectrum of 3I Atlas is the result of a dust cloud surrounding it, then the dust particles must have a size comparable to the wavelength of visible light, about 0.5 micrometers. For dust particles of this size, solar radiation pressure is stronger than gravity. Within a day, the dust would have been displaced to a tail stretching across a few arc seconds behind 3I Atlas. This tail of submicron dust would have scattered sunlight for the same reason that reddens it. Embedded ice particles that evaporate would have left familiar spectroscopic signatures of gas around 3I Atlas. However, we've seen neither gas tails nor dust tails of any kind, but rather a mysterious glow ahead of 3I Atlas, which makes no sense whatsoever, although Avi Loeb has speculated that it might be material being intentionally sprayed ahead of the object to detect any sort of objects that might be on a collision course, so 3I Atlas can avoid them, sort of a subparticle deflector shield. But if most dust particles are larger than a micron in size, then they would encounter less push by radiation pressure because of their smaller surface to mass ratio, and in that case, the reddening of 3I Atlas must be explained by the red surface of 3I Atlas, implying that the object, once again, has a diameter of 20 kilometers. And of course, this is a very, very unlikely event, because a massive object like this should only encounter our solar system once every 50,000 years or so. Now, Loeb has suggested another possibility. Might the dust plume around 3I Atlas be simply the result of microscopic fragmentation of the surface of a solid object which has traveled for billions of years through interstellar space? Impacts by interstellar dust particles and interstellar gas particles can easily create a thin layer of dust on the surface of an object with no accompanying ices if 3I Atlas is not a comet. The interstellar speed of 3I Atlas at 60 kilometers per second relative to the local interstellar medium means that any impacting matter would deliver 10 times more energy per impacting proton than required to break up a single chemical bond within the solid surface. This microscopic breakup of the surface to supermicron fragments by interstellar impactors such as dust, gas, and cosmic ray particles might have led over billions of years to the formation of large dust particles that are released close to the sun and account for the glow ahead of 3I Atlas. With this interpretation of the glow preceding 3I Atlas, the associated plume of dust does not make it a comet. In contrast with the interstellar comet 2I Borisov, the glow around 3I Atlas is much smaller in size and does not show a bright trailing tail, even though the surface area of 3I Atlas is much larger than that of 2I Borisov. We're talking about a factor of a few thousand. Moreover, 2I Borisov show clear evidence for H2O and carbon monoxide, all the things that 3I Atlas lacks. But what about Oumuamua? Well, unfortunately, since Oumuamua is far smaller than 3I Atlas, even the best telescopes on Earth, and even Hubble and other telescopes, could not give us a very clear idea of its appearance, aside from the fact that it's very long and very thin. Might be a cylinder or stick-like object, as depicted here, or it might be a thin disk of some kind. Regardless, an unusual shape for an asteroid or a comet, but not completely without precedent. It is its behavior that made Oumuamua so strange, because even though 3I Atlas and its trajectory are very strange, its appearance is strange and anomalous, and in many ways it doesn't resemble a comet, even though visually it looks like one. Oumuamua's behavior is really what made it such a remarkable object. For one thing, it tumbled at a very consistent rate, about 3 times per day, but that's not what is the most important aspect. The most important detail with Oumuamua, and the one that continues to confound astronomers to this day, was the fact that it began to accelerate as it went out of the solar system. Accelerate non-gravitationally. The influence of the sun, other planets, and even a gravitational slingshot as it spun around the sun as well, none of those things could account for Oumuamua's acceleration as it began to leave the solar system. The only natural object in space that accelerates non-gravitationally is a comet, but it requires a significant amount of cometary outgassing to cause a significant change in velocity, and No cometary outgassing at all was detected with Oumuamua. This makes it a unique object if it were natural. We have seen nothing in nature, nothing in the solar system or otherwise, that corresponds to the behavior of Oumuamua. We have, however, seen artificial objects that behave this way because of solar radiation pressure. A hollow metallic object, or a metallic object that is largely hollow, like a spacecraft, for example, can accelerate as the result of solar radiation pressure alone. And here's another bizarre characteristic. Cometary outgassing, especially outgassing violent enough to cause a substantial change in velocity or an observable change in velocity, should also have changed the rotational speed of a comet or a natural object. Assuming that some sort of mysterious, invisible cometary outgassing were taking place with the Oumuamua, then it should have changed its rotational speed, and yet it didn't. Its rotation remained constant and unchanging, and that would have happened if it were being pushed by solar radiation pressure alone. But again, solar radiation pressure is not significant enough to change the velocity of a solid object like a comet or an asteroid, but it can change the velocity of an artificial object that is mostly hollow. So all of this being the case, I decided to ask Grok its opinion on the subject, while also telling it to disregard any sort of scientific bias like extraordinary claims require extraordinary circumstances, and to compare Oumuamua to both natural objects and artificial objects like 2020 SO, which we thought to be an asteroid at first, but we later identified to be an artificial object when it accelerated non-gravitationally. It's actually the Centaur upper stage of a rocket launched on September 20th, 1966 that carried the Surveyor 2 spacecraft out to the moon. So I decided to ask Grok which object Oumuamua more closely resembled, and this is what it had to say, quote, "Considering the possibility that Oumuamua could be a mostly hollow artificial object, and acknowledging that no known comet accelerates significantly without visible outgassing, while artificial objects like 2020 SO do so via solar radiation pressure, Oumuamua more closely resembles an artificial object like 2020 SO than a comet. The non-gravitational acceleration, explainable by radiation pressure if Oumuamua is low density, aligns with the behavior of lightweight artificial debris. Its reflective surface and tumbling motion further support similarity to 2020 SO, while the faint particle halo and reddish hue lean slightly towards a natural object. The lack of comet-like outgassing and the precedent of artificial objects accelerating via radiation pressure make the artificial debris hypothesis a much closer match based on the observed facts. It's amazing what an AI will tell you when it's not being influenced by biased astronomers. So what's our final conclusion here? Well, I think it's pretty obvious at this point. Even though 3i Atlas has many things about it that scream artificial intent or an artificial control of some kind, there are so many things about what it's doing that suggest that it might have been sent here by design. It has done absolutely nothing in terms of its flight through the solar system to suggest that it might be artificial. It has not behaved like an artificial object. Granted, hasn't really behaved like a classic comet either, but it hasn't done anything to suggest artificiality. Whereas the big difference with the Oumuamua, as we saw in the video, is the fact that it accelerated as it began to leave the solar system, accelerated without any signs of outgassing. There are no natural objects, at least no natural objects that we've observed, that have ever been able to do this. There are these mysterious objects called dark comets, which, by the way, may very well be just lost spacecraft that we have sent out into interplanetary space that we lost control of. There's quite a few of those kinds of craft out there that we have yet to account for, but assuming that that isn't the case, assuming these are natural objects, even dark comets don't accelerate nearly to the extent that Oumuamua did. There is no parallel, no precedent in nature for an object that accelerates non-gravitationally without some kind of visible outgassing. The only object, as you saw in the video, and Grok agrees with me on this, by the way, that does these sorts of things is an artificial object. Could be just a piece of space debris, could be little more than a hollow booster, a piece of a rocket from an ancient alien civilization. Although I tend to doubt that, because the other things that Oumuamua did, especially its close approach against all odds to our Earth, passing straight through the Goldilocks zone of our solar system at almost exactly the right time to get a good look at our planet, all of that is a bit strange, seems to scream artificial control. But again, if we're talking about the sorts of things that make this object appear artificial, that make Oumuamua resemble an artificial object much more so than it does a natural one, well, it is that non-gravitational acceleration combined with all the other strange things that it did. But that in particular is the one undeniable thing which up to this point astronomers have not been able to satisfactorily explain. Sure, they've come out with all kinds of wild theories that we've never actually observed in nature, imagined objects that have non-gravitational acceleration without observed outgassing. But until we see something in nature that corresponds to these theories, that proves that such an object could actually exist, it's very difficult, in my opinion, to take those kinds of theories seriously, especially when you consider that we have objects in real life that we definitely can look at, that we definitely can observe, that have behaved exactly as Oumuamua did. The problem is, of course, that they're artificial objects. And once you start drifting into that forbidden category, well, that's what gets you into deep trouble. Thank you very much for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe. Also, please keep in mind this weekend, in other words, through tomorrow, is your last opportunity to get 200K merchandise. After that, it's going to disappear out of the store. The store will actually close down completely at that point. I can't tell you exactly when it's going to reopen, but in any event, your last chance to get your hands on this awesome merchandise will be tomorrow. If you'd like to support the channel in some other way, please consider supporting us on Patreon. We have over 20 exclusive videos for Patreon supporters there. Thanks again for watching, and until next time, stay angry about space.